Hello, everyone, and thank you for those of you who stayed here after the 5 next talks just to listen about tests. That's really some dedication. And I will try to keep it short and crisp, because who am I to stand between the people and their coffee? So don't worry, won't take long. And quickly reintroducing myself, because Alex did amazing thing introducing, just forgot to mention that I'm also a Vue.js core team member. I write documentation, so if you have any problems or don't like the docs, that's me. I'm sorry, but doing my best. And as a principal engineer at GitLab, I do a lot of code reviews. And lately, for maybe 2 last years, 90% of my comments on the code reviews are on tests. Because apparently we learned how to write good Vue code and Next code and do everything right, but everyone has an opinion about tests, and quite often people write tests without understanding why they're writing them, how, and what exactly they are testing. And my talk has a word better in a name, but before we're making anything better, let's also figure out how do we measure what is a good test. I have a simple definition for this, and we will be measuring against this. The test should fail if the component on the test behaves like it shouldn't, like show some unexpected behavior. The test should not fail when something unrelated to the component shows unexpected behavior. We shouldn't be caring about this. That's why the tests are robust, right? Like if it doesn't fail when something unrelated fails. So with this definition, we can start, and we will be using VTest and Vue test utils. You may ask, why not Vue testing library? This was previous documentation thing. We had Vue testing library, and we even stated that Vue testing library is for common cases, for people who start with tests, while Vue test utils is for advanced cases. Well, apparently Vue testing library does have an issue with suspense wrapper. So we removed this from the docs, and we recommend Vue test utils for unit testing from now on. So a quick thing, I think you all know about this, but just in general, how does unit test work? You have some unit that you're testing. You provide some input, you expect some output. As simple as that. And when you test some kind of a function, like capitalizing the first letter, writing unit test is not problematic. Because you say, OK, you pass the input, a string, you expect the capitalized string. Simple, easy, nothing, almost nothing to test. But when we're testing a component, a Vue component, what is the input? What is the output, even more importantly, because we're testing the output? So Vue components may look very complicated, but in the nutshell, the output of every single component is rendered HTML. First and foremost, we want to test that our component shows on the screen something that we expect it to show. Emitted events. Whenever the component communicates with a parent, that's considered component output. And any kind of side effects. And side effects of everything else component does, not in the methods sometimes. API calls, imported functions, routing, any kind of pinia action. This is always considered a side effect. If you are expecting in the test something outside of these 3 categories, most likely you're not testing the output, and we will talk about this. So let's start, and for this we will be testing an application. Very simple one, super ugly. Sorry, CSS is not my strongest side. And the component looks extremely simple. We have 2 fields, login and password. And we have a button that is disabled by default. We type something here, we type something here. Button switches to enabled. We click the button, we have some loading state. And we have a result. In this particular case, we are testing an error, right? But if I put my name and a magic password, it's called password, apparently it shows a welcome message. So this looks quite simple, but this will help us to structure our test. Because you can clearly see that we are going through a few different states, like a default one when we are showing the form, the success one, just welcome message, and some error state. And on top of this, we have some loading. So when you start writing your test, it's quite helpful to go with a structure. So we have a component, and I usually just try to do, some people don't, but you just check the state. So by default, you have the form, you have the button, the text on the button is submit, and then you start performing different checks. So it disables the button when only one field is filled. It disables the button when the second one is filled, but first is not. And then you have a huge describes, like when it's filled, and we click the submit, when it's filled, and you submit the form, when it's loading, and on success, and so on and so on. Structuring the test this way, not like testing methods, testing computers. It's quite intuitive, and it also works as a specification of your component. If you like TDD, it's also a good point to start sometimes with the test and then with the component. I prefer to write tests after. So let's start, and we will be live coding the test and looking at the things that we learned. So we structure the test accordingly, and first, we want to test if our component renders the form. So I have a helper for mounting the component, and I expect my find form, right, to be true. It should be existing. Let's open our terminal. The tests are running. The first test is passed. And it might look good, but there is something wrong about it. Any guesses? No guesses, good. We're looking for a form in the component, and we used here, as we are searching by HTML element. Find works just like JavaScript find. It will find the first form in the component. Imagine if you added one more. Won't work anymore. Apparently, there is no perfect solution for this, because you will need some unique identifier, and different developers go different ways for these unique identifiers. It can be class. It can be any kind of data attribute. It can be ref, because Vue test util work with refs. We just decided to go with data test IDs as an attribute. Downsides, it will be visible in the rendered HTML. Upside is you are controlling it super nicely. So instead of form, it's always a good idea to provide some more of the unique identifier. In this particular case, we want to have data. No, not here. So, sorry. We want to have data test ID equal to form. Still passes, surprisingly. As you can see in all the upcoming tests, we will be still checking on the form multiple times. So we will be seeing that form calls the API, whatever, that we don't render the form in some particular cases. And of course, you can just copy-paste this wrapper find and go with it everywhere. But it's quite useful to start with your finding helpers early. So I will just create a helper called it find form. It's a function that just performs the same search. And let me just close this one. Again, why finders? Because your component will live and evolve outside of your control. Sometimes you will replace the form with this data test ID with something else. Sometimes the whole component changes. When you're looking for a button, it can be replaced by button component or something else. And then in tests, you will need to go and do all the replacement in every single test case. Having helpers like this just helps from the start, because you're just replacing it in one thing, and then just use helper everywhere. So we will start with this too. Okay. Let's look at the form and see how it's rendered with which condition. In this particular case, we're using logged in as the thing for render a form, right? It's a condition. And more often than not, when people write tests for just rendering something or just testing, you would see this. Wrapper VM logged in is false. And that's an expectation. So we have the component property, and we expect this property to be false because we're rendering the form. This is still true. And for data properties like I'm using it here, maybe it's not as common, but people like, and they like a lot, to test computeds like this. So you have some kind of a computed property, maybe with some complicated logic, and in your test you expect that some computed returns you some particular data. Why we shouldn't do that? Well, imagine if some developer just messed up with the logic, and now I render form when I'm logged in. The component works completely off. Right now, I won't see the form. I will see nothing on the screen if I go to my, well, welcome without even a name, because I use VLs, right? The test is passing. Why? Because instead of testing the component output, we are testing the component internal. If logged in was a computed property, it changes nothing. You should never test computed property in isolation. Heard it multiple times, but I'm testing this method of computed in isolation. Well, you shouldn't. Not in the component test. If the computed is that complicated, move the logic outside of it, in some helper, and test it in isolation. So, right now my test should fail. A good test fails when component shows an unexpected behavior. I expected the form to be visible, not is logged in to be true. So, abstract in fighting components and elements, avoid touching component internals. And then let's go to the next test, which is even more, I would say, more interesting. It renders submit button, submit text on the submit button. This text test is a bit different because submit button is a component. As you can see, it's called confirm button. It has some props passed, it has some event emitted, and we want to make sure that it renders the test correctly. So again, more often than not, what happens? Let's write a helper here. I want to find my confirm button, and it's a function. Let's do wrapper. So how people usually test this? You can see that I'm using shallow mount in my test. What shallow mount does, it mounts the parent component, the component under test, and it uses stubs for every child component. How people test the child component text? First of all, I'm changing it to mount. Now I'm rendering all the HTML of the confirm button. And we go here with mount component, and we expect find confirm button text to be, well, submit. Passes perfectly. What do you want from this particular test? And looks fine. We're not testing the component properties. We're not testing anything internals. That's the output. That's HTML. However, imagine that you have this confirm button coming not from your own code base, but from some component library, especially the component library you don't control. And they made some kind of the changes. They added some text over here. They used some internalization or something like that. Wow, the test fails. Because what we're doing here, we are accessing the child component property, the text in this particular case, from the parent component. And this breaks our second rule. our test shouldn't fail when something unrelated to our component fails. Here, the mistake isn't the child component, but it makes our parent component fail. If it was an integration test or any kind of end-to-end test, that's completely fine because you're testing the whole tree. For component tests, for unit testing, it's unacceptable. So we can keep this here, but change the things over here. One additional rule of thumb that if you change in shallow mount to mount and back, and your test passes in one mount but fails in a different one, probably something is going off. You're either accessing child components or you're doing some forbidden magic over there. So let's come here, go back with a shallow mount. And instead of testing the text, let's test the component, the child component API. What we control? What is parent component controlling? Parent component only controlling the props. We need to make sure that we pass in the prop and this prop is correct. We don't know what child component is going to do with that prop, and honestly, that's not our problem. So instead, we're doing props, and the props button text should be submit. Now child component can add text, can change text, can do whatever they want, but essentially we ensure that we passed the correct one. And this one is quite holy war because there is a whole testing ideology, I think mostly promoted by Candles, where you test the whole tree and it has its own point, and that's amazingly good. However, I prefer to treat my component tests as isolated units. That's why we're treating child components as black boxes. We don't know what's there. Okay. Now a bit of a tricky one too. Now we want to make sure that we are keeping the button disabled when we have some text in the field. So first we want to fill only the username, keep the password empty, make sure that submit button is disabled because we don't want to see it enabled. And let's mount some component. And now I need to fill the field. First, and possibly the most thrown thing, I don't know why view test utils is not throwing an error on this because they should, is let's just set the data this way. Username is equal to John, right? And I expect my confirm button. I will just copy paste it from here. Props disabled to be true. It is true indeed like it should, but here we are just changing the property of the component, the value and the property of the component with wrapper.vm. So we're accessing the internals. And what's interesting, let's also set the password to John. It's still disabled. We will touch this back a bit later, like why it's still disabled, just because we also need to perform an additional tick. But you never should go this way. Again, still surprised that there is no error thrown, because there was a promise from VTU team to throw errors on these things. Instead, we need to change the field the same way user does. Why? Well, right now we have a V model, right? So I just put a value, it goes to the user field. But what if I do this? The value will still be there, the test is passing, everything is completely fine. The problem is, though, that when user in the real component enters the username, it doesn't go to the calculation, to the computer that calculates the submit button and button text as well. So you can see that if I put a value over here, test is passing, everything's cool, but the component is not working. So instead of this, there is a recommendation to use a helper set data. It still won't help us. What we should do in the cases where we want to change the component data after the mount? The best possible way is following the user. How the user changes the field in your test? Well, they set the value on the input, right? So we will find the input, not using the helper here. We have an ID, that's a unique one, so I will just go with ID username. We are setting the value. This way we ensure that we are going exactly the same way user does in the component. It still will be true, and just as I mentioned, even if I put password here, still passing because we need an additional next tick. Set value is asynchronous, so I can perform a next tick, just next tick. Oh my God, it's like 5 talks of next, and I'm never saying next again. So if we wait for those two, the test failed because I put 2 fields in. If I remove one, you can see that currently the test is passing correctly like it should. It's also a good practice to always make your test fail. Put it in the condition where it should fail and see it failing. So following the user and not forgetting about the view microtasks. This talk should have been 30 minutes, but I see I have only 1 minute left, so it will be 25. Promise to make it shorter. So we will not finish this particular test because, well, we will be using exactly the same practices as we had over here, just copy-pasting this to this test. And also, I have the finished test in the repository if you're curious about this. And if you just want to see the finished one, it's over here. And 1 minute for coffee. Thank you, everyone.